Well, welcome to Sunday.
Good morning.
Tell us about the summit, which I think you urged on the Prime Minister on Friday. Why the sudden urgency to talk to the three premiers?
Well, we are approaching a really serious crisis in the Murray-Darling Basin, in particular in the lower basin in the Murray system. The average inflows into the Murray are 11,000 gigalitres over a water year, which starts on 1 June. Most of the water comes in winter and spring. So far, from 1st June this year, we've had less than 600 gigalitres, between 5 and 600 gigs. It's likely that the total inflows this year will be about 1,000 gigalitres, which is about half of the lowest inflows ever. So this is a very significant step change down in water availability. And what that means is that by the end of the irrigation season in April or May, the big dams on the river, the Hume Dam and the Dartmouth Dam and of course Lake Victoria, which serves largely to protect South Australia, will be just about empty. And that raises big issues in terms of water management. How do we ensure there's water for cities and towns? How do we ensure there's enough water to support our horticultural industries in particular, who've got permanent plantings that need to have water to stay alive?
So what can you do about it? What's on the agenda? Any solutions?
Well, the solutions are going to be, they're not really solutions, it's really a question of coping with this drought. But what we'll be looking at is ways in which we can change, and we'll be seeking advice plainly from the water managers in the states and of course from the Murray-Darling Basin Commission, looking how we can best manage the resource and put in place some contingency plans to ensure that those important interests I mentioned, cities, towns and agriculture, are protected in the event of there being very little water next year.
Are we just talking about a drought, or are we talking about a permanent change due to global warming?
Well, I think as Ray Martin's program demonstrates, we've got to recognise that we've always lived in a very variable climate here in Australia. We have had shocking droughts before. Federation drought this is similar to the Federation drought. The reason it's worse, Laurie, is not so much because there's less rain than there was in the Federation drought. The statistics are pretty similar. But what's changed is that our dependence on water has become so much greater. Our cities are bigger, our towns are bigger, and we're drawing much more water for agriculture than we ever were before. In 1920, and rainfall pre-1950 was a lot lower than it's been in the second half of last century. In 1920, we were diverting about 2,000 gigalitres for agriculture in the Murray-Darling Basin. Now, in a normal year, we divert around 12,000. And so, as agriculture has grown, as cities have grown, our demand for and reliance upon water has increased, and that's why this is the worst drought.
Is it fair enough to say that what this has shown us is the stupidity of using our water to grow rice, cotton, for flooding pasture? And if that's true, why don't you take on the Nationals and stop it?
Well, let me put some of this in context, Laurie. Firstly, we have to use water more efficiently everywhere, in every part of our lives, be it in cities, industry or in agriculture. And that is a key focus of all of the Australian government's water policy, is the more efficient use of water. And we're focusing a lot of money on irrigation efficiencies, and that's why we're investing in infrastructure in the Murray system, for example, to promote efficiencies. But let me just make one point about rice and cotton. One of the virtues of annual crops is that you only plant them when there's water available. And one of the problems with permanent plantings, horticulture, grapes, almonds, olives, is that you need to put water on them to keep those trees alive, whether there's a flood or a drought. And so you really need to have a mix of crop types through a river system, particularly one as variable as Australia's. And personally, and I say this as a politician, but also as someone who comes from a business background, I'm very sceptical about governments being able to decide what crops farmers should plant. I don't think an Australian government crop selection committee would make the right decisions. Farmers have enough trouble making those choices. I think it's important that we allow water to trade and that farmers to make their own choices and their own judgments about what crops to plant, because it will depend both on the soil types, of course, but in particular on the perceptions of the degree of certainty that can be attached to future water availability.
I assume this summit won't deal with the problem of urban water. So
it's focused on the Murray. Yeah.
Do we need a summit on our city water supplies? Is the situation that serious?
Well, I believe the situation in the cities is very serious. It's a very frustrating problem because unlike the Murray River, which is dependent on rainfall and runoff, all of our big coastal cities can have as much water as they're prepared to pay for. The reason we are short of water in our big cities is because state governments, and in some cases local governments, have simply failed to make the investments in dams, in recycling or in desalination, in many different approaches to make the water available. Perth is the honourable exception to that. They have done a pretty comprehensive job in doing a whole lot of things. But Brisbane, Sydney, Melbourne in particular have made very little investment in new water infrastructure for a long time. In fact, a decade ago, as you know, in Sydney, the incoming Labor government, led by Mr Carr, cancelled plans for a new dam. Now, that might have been the right decision from an environmental point of view, but having cancelled the new dam, they then didn't do anything else. And so Sydney is now in a situation where the population has grown, stream flows have declined because we're getting less rain and it's hotter, and naturally we've got a water deficit. But this city could have as much water as it wanted to.
You seem to say in the speeches I've read that the answer is a free market system, a market system in water involving private enterprise. Now, how do you see that working, say, in Sydney or Melbourne? Well,
you need to let the private sector provide water into our cities to participate. I mean, we've seen in the last few weeks Macquarie Bank acquire the largest water company in the United Kingdom. 3 of the biggest water companies in the United Kingdom are owned by Australian institutions: Macquarie Bank, Westpac and the Commonwealth Bank. There are billions of dollars in the private sector available to go into water infrastructure. But because the urban water markets are controlled by state governments who want to protect their own monopolies, out of which they extract an enormous amount of cash. I mean, they run these businesses for cash by not investing, by imposing restrictions to constrain demand instead of increasing supply. They preserve their cash, take the dividends, and here we are running out of water in cities which really should be able to have all the water they need.